Long before the United States became a country, many different Native American nations lived across the land. In the southeastern part of what is now the United States, there were 5 large and prosperous tribes. These were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. They are often called the 5 civilized tribes because they had adopted many aspects of the culture of their white neighbors. They lived in settled communities, built homes, and farmed the land. Their lands were rich and fertile, filled with forests, rivers, and mountains that had sustained their people for countless generations, holding their stories and the bones of their ancestors. These nations had created complex societies with their own governments, laws, and traditions. The Cherokee, for example, had a written language, created by a man named Sequoyah, and they even had their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. They built schools for their children and established successful farms with cultivated fields of corn, beans, and squash. They lived in log cabins, much like the white settlers who were moving into the areas around them. They believed they could live in peace with the newcomers and maintain their own way of life on the lands that had always been their home, a place deeply connected to their identity and spirit. Their homelands covered large parts of what we now know as Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Florida. These were not just empty lands, they were places of deep meaning. Every mountain had a name, every river held a story, and every forest was a source of food, medicine, and shelter. The people had a strong spiritual connection to the earth beneath their feet. They saw themselves not as owners of the land, but as its caretakers, a sacred duty passed down from one generation to the next. This profound bond with their ancestral territories was something the new American settlers often failed to understand or respect. However, the growing United States saw these lands differently. As more and more white settlers moved westward, they wanted more land for farming, especially for growing cotton, which was becoming very profitable. The settlers began to look with envy at the well-tended farms and rich territories of the Native American nations. They saw the land not as a sacred home, but as a source of wealth. This greed for land put immense pressure on the U.S. government to do something. The peaceful coexistence that the 5 tribes had hoped for was becoming increasingly fragile as the demand for their removal grew louder and more insistent. The desire for Native American land led to a terrible new law. In 1830, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, and President Andrew Jackson signed it. This law did not order the tribes to be moved by force, but it gave the president the power to negotiate treaties with them. The government would offer them new land in an area west of the Mississippi River, which was called Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. In exchange, the tribes would have to give up their ancestral homelands in the southeast. President Jackson strongly supported this policy, believing it was for the good of the country, and even for the Native Americans themselves. Many people, including some members of Congress like Davy Crockett, spoke out against the act. They argued that it was unjust and cruel to force people from their homes. The Native American nations, especially the Cherokee, also fought back using the legal system. They took their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In a famous case called Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the court actually sided with the Cherokee Nation. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the state of Georgia had no authority over the Cherokee and their lands. It was a legal victory, but sadly it was a victory that would not be enforced. President Andrew Jackson famously defied the Supreme Court's decision. He is reported to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The federal government and the state of Georgia simply ignored the court's ruling. They continued to pressure the 5 tribes to sign removal treaties. A small, unauthorized group of Cherokee leaders, who did not represent the majority of their people, was persuaded to sign the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. This treaty sold all Cherokee lands to the government for a small sum of money and promised them new lands in the West. The vast majority of the Cherokee people, led by their principal chief John Ross, did not accept this treaty. They considered it a fraud because it was signed without the consent of their official government or their people. They protested and sent petitions to Washington, D.C., pleading with the government to honor their rights and the Supreme Court's decision. Despite their peaceful and legal protests, their pleas were ignored. The U.S. Senate approved the fraudulent treaty by a single vote. The stage was now set for one of the most tragic events in American history: the forced removal of thousands of men, women, and children from their homes. With the treaty in place, The U.S. government sent soldiers to enforce the removal. In the spring and summer of 1838, federal troops and state militia arrived in Cherokee territory. They forced Cherokee families out of their homes at gunpoint, giving them little to no time to gather their belongings. People were dragged from their fields, their cabins, and their beds. They had to leave behind their homes, their farms, their animals, and almost everything they owned. Families were separated in the chaos, and the life they had always known was destroyed in an instant. It was a time of great fear, confusion, and heartbreak for the Cherokee people. The Cherokee were first herded into crowded, unsanitary stockades and internment camps to await their long journey west. In these camps, disease spread quickly. Hundreds died from sickness, malnutrition, and despair before the journey even began. When the removal started, the people were forced to march over 1,000 miles, mostly on foot. They traveled through parts of Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas to reach Indian Territory. This long, brutal journey became known as the Trail of Tears, or as the Cherokee called it, Nuna Dal Isunyi, the trail where they cried. The journey was harsh and unforgiving, especially for the very young and the very old. The conditions during the march were horrific. The people faced freezing winters with inadequate clothing and shelter. They walked through snow and ice with little more than thin blankets to protect them. Food was scarce, and what was provided was often spoiled or not enough to feed everyone. Starvation and hunger were constant companions on the trail. Sickness, such as whooping cough, typhus, and dysentery, swept through the traveling groups, killing many. There was no proper medicine or care for the sick. Every day was a struggle for survival, filled with pain and immense suffering. The emotional and spiritual toll was just as devastating as the physical hardship. People watched their loved ones, their children, their parents, and their friends, grow weak and die along the side of the road. They were often not even allowed to stop and give them a proper burial. It is estimated that out of the 16,000 Cherokee who were forced to make the journey, more than 4,000 died. This immense loss left a deep and lasting wound on the hearts of the survivors. The trail was not just a path across the land, it was a journey through unimaginable grief and sorrow. When the survivors of the Trail of Tears finally arrived in Indian Territory, they faced new challenges. The land was unfamiliar, and they had to start their lives over from nothing. They had lost their homes, their possessions, and a significant portion of their population. The trauma of the removal deeply affected their communities for many generations. The promises made by the U.S. government were often broken, and the land they were given in the West was not as fertile as their ancestral homelands. Despite these incredible hardships, the Cherokee people and the other removed tribes showed amazing resilience. They worked to rebuild their nations, establish new governments, and preserve their culture and language. The memory of the Trail of Tears is a vital part of American history. It serves as a powerful and painful reminder of the injustice and suffering that can result from greed, racial prejudice, and the abuse of power. It is a story about broken treaties and the failure of the U.S. government to uphold its own laws and honor the rights of Native American peoples. Learning about this event helps us understand the complex and often tragic history of the relationship between the United States and the continent's first inhabitants. It is a history that is not always easy to face, but it is necessary for a true understanding of the nation's past. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered in many ways. It is designated as a National Historic Trail, with markers along the routes that the tribes were forced to travel. Museums, cultural centers, and the tribal nations themselves work to educate the public and keep the memory of this history alive. By remembering the Trail of Tears, we honor the thousands of people who suffered and died, and we also honor the strength and perseverance of those who survived. It teaches us the importance of empathy, justice, and respecting the rights and cultures of all people. It is important to learn about the Trail of Tears, so that we do not forget the lessons of the past. It reminds us that history is made up of the stories of real people, whose lives were forever changed by the actions of others. By understanding this dark chapter, we can work towards a future where such injustices are never repeated. Acknowledging this history is a step toward healing and building a more honest and respectful relationship with Native American communities. The echoes of the Trail of Tears remind us to listen to the voices that have often been silenced and to always stand up for what is right.